The rain pounded the cracked pavement of 42nd Street, each drop a cold reminder of the world's indifference. A young girl, no older than 10, stood shivering under a tattered awning, her thin jacket soaked through. Her name was Lila, and her eyes wide, hazel, and far too old for her years, scanned the bustling crowd for a chance, a flicker of kindness, anything to fill the gnawing hole in her stomach. She clutched a crumpled paper cup, her fingers numb, and whispered to herself, "Just $1 more. One more, and I can eat tonight." Lila wasn't new to this corner of the city. For 3 years, since her mother vanished into the haze of addiction and her father's name became just a blank space on her birth certificate, she'd survived on the streets of New York. Foster homes hadn't worked, too many rules, too little warmth, and so she'd learned to navigate the urban jungle alone. Her days were a cycle of scavenging, begging, and dodging the dangers that lurked in alleyways. Tonight, hunger was her loudest enemy, clawing at her insides with a ferocity that made her knees weak. Across the street, the neon glow of Antonio's diner spilled onto the wet sidewalk, promising warmth and the rich aroma of fresh burgers and fries. Lila's stomach growled as she watched people hurry inside, their laughter muffled by the glass doors. She'd been kicked out of places like that before. Managers didn't take kindly to street rats lingering too long. But tonight, desperation pushed her forward. She crossed the street, her sneakers squelching, and pressed her face against the diner's window. Inside, a man in a tailored suit sat alone at a booth, his plate piled high with food he'd barely touched. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with silver hair and a face carved with lines of success and solitude. His name was Edward Grayson, a real estate tycoon whose name graced skyscrapers across Manhattan. To Lila, he was just a stranger with leftovers. She pushed open the door, the bell jingling above her, and felt the weight of every stare in the room. The waitress frowned, already reaching for the no loitering speech, but Lila's eyes were locked on Edward's table. She shuffled forward, clutching her cup, and stopped beside him. Her voice, small but steady, cut through the diner's hum. "May I have your leftovers, sir?" Edward looked up, startled. His fork hovered over a half-eaten burger, and for a moment, he seemed annoyed, ready to wave her off like so many others had. But then his gaze met hers. Those hazel eyes, brimming with a quiet strength and a pain he couldn't name, stopped him cold. It wasn't just hunger he saw, it was something deeper, something that tugged at a memory he'd buried long ago. A miracle didn't happen in that instant, not in the way fairy tales promise, but something shifted. Edward's hand lowered, and he gestured to the seat across from him. "Sit," he said, his voice softer than he'd intended. "What's your name?" Lila hesitated. Strangers offering kindness often came with strings attached. She'd learned that the hard way, once escaping a man who'd promised food but wanted something she wasn't willing to give. Her heart raced, but the warmth of the diner and the smell of food were too much to resist. She slid into the booth, keeping her cup close like a shield. "Lila," she said quietly. Edward ordered her a meal, nothing fancy, just a burger, fries, and a milkshake. Lila ate like she hadn't in days, which wasn't far from the truth. As she did, Edward watched, his mind drifting to a daughter he'd lost decades ago. Emily had been 8 when the car accident took her and his wife, leaving him with nothing but wealth and regret. Lila's eyes, her quiet resilience, reminded him of Emily in a way that ached. He asked her questions, where she lived, why she was alone, and Lila, guarded at first, let slip fragments of her story: a mother gone, a system that failed her, a life of surviving one day at a time. The challenges Lila faced were relentless. Hunger was only the start. Winters in New York were brutal, and she'd spent nights curled up in doorways, using newspapers as blankets. She'd learned to avoid certain streets where gangs preyed on kids like her, and she dodged social workers who meant well but would send her back to foster homes where she felt like a stranger. Trust was her biggest hurdle. She'd been betrayed too often, by adults who promised safety only to disappear. Yet here was this man, a stranger with kind eyes, listening to her like she mattered. Edward faced his own struggles, though they were less visible. His wealth insulated him from the world, but it couldn't fill the void Emily's death had left. He'd poured himself into work, building an empire while his heart calcified. Charity galas and donations were easy, but connecting with someone, truly seeing them, was a risk he hadn't taken in years. Lila's presence challenged that. He saw in her a chance to do something real, not just write a check, but it meant opening himself to pain again. The diner became their meeting place. Edward returned the next night, and the next, always with a meal for Lila. She started to trust him, sharing more about her dreams. She wanted to be an artist, to paint the city not as it was, but as it could be. Edward bought her a sketchbook, and her drawings, raw but vivid, filled its pages. But trust was fragile. When Edward offered to get her off the streets, Lila panicked. She'd heard stories of kids being taken in only to be used or abandoned. One night, she didn't show up at the diner. Edward searched for her, his heart pounding with a fear he hadn't felt since Emily's accident. He found her in an alley, sick with a fever, her sketchbook clutched to her chest. That was the turning point. Edward took her to a hospital, paying for her care despite her protests. When she recovered, he didn't push her into a system she feared. Instead, he worked with a local non-profit to find her a safe place to stay, a small group home with kind staff who understood trauma. It wasn't perfect. Lila still struggled to believe she deserved stability. She'd push Edward away, testing him, waiting for him to give up like everyone else. But he didn't. He showed up with art supplies, sat with her through her silences, and listened when she finally spoke. Edward's challenge was patience. He wanted to fix Lila's life overnight, but healing took time. He had to learn her pace, her fears, and the walls she'd built to survive. His own guilt resurfaced. Why hadn't he been there for Emily the way he was for Lila now? Those nights alone in his penthouse, staring at old photos, were his darkest. But Lila's small victories, her first painting hung in the group home, her tentative smile when he praised her work, gave him purpose. Months passed, and Lila began to thrive. The group home became a real home, and Edward became a fixture in her life, not as a savior but as a friend. He never adopted her. Lila wasn't ready for that, and he respected her boundaries, but he was there, steady and present. One day, Lila gave him a painting, a vibrant cityscape, not of skyscrapers but of people, strangers helping each other, their faces alive with hope. At the bottom, she'd written, "For Edward, who saw me." The miracle wasn't a lightning bolt or a divine intervention. It was quieter, slower, built on small acts of courage and connection. Lila found a family, not in a traditional sense, but in the people who chose her. Edward, the group home staff, the art teacher who saw her talent. Edward found redemption, not by erasing his past, but by giving Lila the future he couldn't give Emily. As the rain fell outside Antonio's diner a year later, Lila sat across from Edward, her sketchbook open, her eyes bright. She wasn't the shivering girl from that first night, and he wasn't the lonely man hiding behind wealth. They were two people who'd found each other in a city of millions, proving that miracles don't always change the world, just the hearts brave enough to believe in them. The story's message lingers. Kindness, when given without expectation, can heal wounds deeper than hunger. It's a call to see the invisible, to offer not just food or money, but time, patience, and belief in someone's worth. For every Lila out there, there's an Edward waiting to listen, if only they dare to look into each other's eyes.